Stuart, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. We were connected by a mutual contact of ours, in fact, a former guest on the show. And once we were introduced, I was looking into your background, what you've done in your previous professional experience before what you've done or what you're doing currently with Heroes. And I really wanted to get you on the show. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I've never a chore to come and sort of speak about all the great stuff and perhaps not so great stuff that's happened.
That's just as valuable. Well, I'm delighted you're here. So maybe we can kick things off then with a little bit about your experience and your background before Heroes. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey thus far?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I'm born in the UK originally. You can probably tell that. I think I spent most of my sort of formative years trying to make sure that I didn't commit to doing anything in particular. Studying business studies, for example, to keep it as broad as possible. But I was very fortunate to fall into the world of telecoms right at the beginning of sort of the internet bubble at the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000. Incredibly exciting place to be at the time. And I'd started on one of these sort of graduate schemes working for a company called WorldCom, which is both famous and infamous, I think, in equal measure. One, because of the sort of growth and, it's very much what Verizon is today, and infamous because I think a couple of the guys did some naughty things and put money in the wrong pots and made it look a bit better than it is. And unfortunately, I think they got caught, or fortunately they got caught, which was an incredible experience to sort of run through, going through that sort of a chapter 11, especially coming into the office almost not knowing what was going to happen every day, whether you actually had a job or not. But to be honest, on the positive side, I was incredibly fortunate because that helped me to really sort of launch my career. I moved to the Netherlands for a while. I moved to Ireland for a while. I was based in Dublin for a couple of years. And then Australia came calling, and I bought a rucksack and a round the world flight and ended up only flying one direction and ended up staying there. Much to my sort of family's annoyance and frustration, and generally being quite upset. But it's obviously a great place, to be. Carried on the telecoms experience. Went to work for a sort of startup business headquartered out of Boston. That was incredible fun. Sitting in my bedroom, 5 minutes wander down to the beach, in sort of Sydney, and trying to sort of build a business out of nothing. With a sort of blank sheet of paper and a laptop that came through the post. It was an incredibly exciting time. And that basically, after a couple of years, took me up to Singapore, and I've been here ever since now, about sort of 14 years in total. Somewhat fortuitously, though, moved out of the telco space and fell into payments and fintech, just as it was starting to become quite cool. I often sort of say that, I joined when it wasn't very cool, and then it became cool, and sort of by default, I think all of a sudden I was cool because it was in fintech, but I can assure you that that's not the case at all. And that took me into my sort of startup journey. A couple of years later, started to sort of think in the sort of evenings and weekends around what I could potentially do, and there was this sort of idea around bringing this reasonably new concept at the time called buy now pay later to Asia, and somehow by basically sort of putting a few people together and having a very clear vision, I think, of what we wanted to create and build, we got it off the ground. I left full-time employment. We built an MVP. I went without money for about a year, and then had the fun of sort of fundraising once and then twice and a couple more times, and then ultimately sort of exiting the business, about 3 or 4 years later. So it was an incredible journey. So that's really the summary of the background up until probably sort of last a year ago.
It's an incredible journey. Thanks so much for sharing with us, Stuart. Talking maybe a little bit more then about hoolah, how did you recognize that there was a big opportunity there? I know you were saying that the buy now, pay later, there was talk of it happening in Asia, but how did you realize, yes, this is something that I'm going to go after? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I remember it vividly. I was sitting in the office at my desk, and we were the company I was working for, WorldPay, which is obviously a big sort of global payments company, and they had won a very big deal with this company in Sweden called Klarna, which was very much one of the first buy now pay later companies. And it was a big thing. We were sort of working with this company, and I was asked to do some PR to sort of share this news in Asia. And I said, well, listen, it's kind of pointless doing this here because one, Klarna aren't here. Two, there's no buy now, pay later, other than some sort of credit card installment payments, through the banks. And the other thing was that a lot of Asian clients don't really go back over to Europe, for example, to go and work. So there's not really a massive market for it. But the interesting thing is, I remember at the time, a lot of merchants were asking us for this opportunity to increase their sort of conversion, perhaps using payments. And typically we were going, well, here's our suite of capability and we could do this and this, but there was nothing really that was really hitting that sort of sweet spot in terms of really delivering, what these guys were looking for. And then it was obviously sort of seeing some of these other companies starting to grow, companies like Afterpay and Zip, down in Australia, which have really been, we're really at the forefront of the growth of that space with their success. And then really looking at Asia, and I think this is probably one of the most interesting things, and probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, to us introducing the hoolah business into Asia, was that there's a lot of cultural background around, perhaps there's more of a generational thing around, I'd rather save my money and then spend later. And we were obviously building this solution where people can spend now and sort of spread their payments over that sort of same period. So it's changing a little bit of the thinking. But what we realized was that the youth of today, the Gen Zs, the millennials, that sort of next generation consumer who are really sort of driving a lot of this, retail purchasing, they weren't influenced by the previous generation. They were influenced by Instagram and TikTok and other sort of social media. And so really that was where the opportunity was, because you saw that change in society, almost in culture, with a significant shift. And that's really where we jumped on the back of that, to enable that. And that was really the coming together of all those different things that helped us to, realize that this is the way forward. Not everyone believed us at the beginning, but I'd like to think that we, that we sort of achieved something. And, there was an article not long ago how, at least in Singapore, it's supposed to be, the biggest payment option in Singapore by 2025. So I think we've proved a point around that.
Stuart, today you're also, in conjunction to working on Heroes, you're also advising. And this is a question that sometimes I ask myself as well. When a company or a group of founders are getting together and they're saying that they want to take on a particular space, such as, let's say in your case, you took on buy now, pay later. And there's all these incumbents in the space. Some are direct competitors, some are indirect competitors. And they're much more, they're further along just by nature of having been around and having all this capital behind themselves and track record. How do you think about, going after something against all those incumbents and saying, us too, we can do this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the us too is a challenge, most definitely. I think in that sort of context, especially if you've got you're in a scenario where there are a number of players which are sort of lookalikes and sort of similar. But ultimately, I think if you're in a position where you can, really understand the sort of consumer problem and you've really looked at where that sort of problem exists and specifically build something around that, especially, a product and a proposition and a brand that speaks for those customers. I think that's where you can really sort of create an opportunity. I mean, for example, credit cards are sort of quite prevalent, with the buy now, pay later space. But in reality, a lot of the younger generation didn't have access to credit cards. The access to credit card installment payments were only for a very, small number of people. And I think when you really dig into that understanding of the customer and understanding of the market, that's where the opportunity can, come into play. And then it comes down to sort of research. And we've done the same with Heroes. We've done an awful lot of work really understanding, the space of which we're sort of sitting in to really construct a, proposition which is unique. It's been called unique from external parties. So I'm quite happy to use that word. And also it's a problem that has not been solved. And I think that's where the, great opportunities sort of sit.
I'm really looking forward to getting to talk about Heroes, but I'd like to just focus on one other aspect of your journey with hoolah, which was around your acquisition then. And I bring this up because it's not every day or not every company that ends up having a successful acquisition or a successful exit. I think every founder hopes that that'll happen one day for them. And I'd love to hear kind of your story of that acquisition, and perhaps any advice that you would have to other founders who are considering in the short or medium term an acquisition, and maybe what the things that they should look out for.
Gosh, yeah, that's a really how long have we got?
Cliff Notes version.
Exactly right. Okay, noted. um, well, where to start? I don't. You go into building something, with an intention of creating something of value. At least that was. If you go into doing that with any other ambition or outcome, I think you lose the direction of what you're trying to achieve, first and foremost. So I think when you set out, you have the right motivation, because when push comes to shove and times get hard, that motivation is basically what sort of sees you through. So that's kind of maybe answering that question by starting out in the right way with the right people, and with the right intent. All of a sudden, when you find yourself in a position where people are taking interest in your business, one, obviously it's great because it means you're on the right path and you've created something of value. I think it's always important to, consider whether this is the right time, to have a view of the future as to whether you think you can continue to, to sort of build this. And, perhaps whether, everything that you've put in and whether you can actually sort of scale that with the resources you've got, whether they are going to be available to you to, really go and sort of complete that dream. Ultimately, as you scale a business, there are a lot more shareholders that are involved in this. When you start getting investors, especially if it's a venture capital backed business, you have their needs and wants and wishes, to take into account as well. So you really are trying to spin a lot of plates around your team, your co-founders, your investors, your shareholders, which are not necessarily investors, your customers, everyone else. So you're really trying to sort of think what's the best path, and it's sort of removing yourself a little bit away from that and thinking whether, this is the right outcome. I'll be honest, we had a number of conversations over a period of time, with a number of different parties, which was, it was interesting. It was challenging. It was fun, all in equal measure, which really makes you a little bit of a chameleon, in that sort of scenario. I think when it came down to it, I think there were some, specific elements that were important to us, and we realized more than anything that the future was going to be very difficult for us to raise enough capital. And it wasn't just the ability to raise equity, to contribute, to running the business, but also, debt capital specifically in this situation, which is also quite hard to get to. There was a little bit of a waning of some of the buy now, pay later space, or the interest in there. There was a little bit of, heat around, the sort of regulatory stuff. And I think that we realized that to really propel us forward, we needed a bigger partner to kind of help us on that board. Now, whether that's going to be a partnership, whether that's going to be a merger acquisition opportunity or something else, was probably something that we needed to look at. And ultimately, the opportunity with the company that bought us, a company called Shopback, was really the best outcome, for everybody. And really, I think the combination then, as I looked at the business and we talked about collectively around what the future would look like, that was a really good fit for the team, the product, everything that we'd created, and it creates something significantly bigger in the future. And that was really the path. I'm not sure there's probably a few, sort of bits of advice in there as you sort of, talk through the story. And of course, it was a much longer journey than that, with plenty of ups and downs along the way. But that was really a lot of the learnings, at least, and the experience of going through that. It's hard. It really is. It's very stressful. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of people, to play. There's a lot of backwards and forwards, and as always through those those sorts of processes, you have to remain calm, cool, and collected if you can.
As a founder who is going through that experience, or is considering that going through an acquisition, do you think that they should be looking at multiple potential acquirers? Should those relationships be established a long time in advance, or is that something that you think can be achieved in a relatively short space of time, depending on the conditions?
Yeah, it takes time. I mean, it really does. I think you don't appreciate the work that needs to go through that. You've got, if you really look at the sort of tactical elements, you've got the term sheet, and then you've got the share purchase agreement you have to run through. You've got all the negotiations that sit with that. You've got the backwards and forwards around, do you agree with this? Do you agree with that? Et cetera, et cetera. There's legal work involved. And of course, then you've got to go through all the due diligence. And there's a hell of a lot, to go through to get to that point. If you've got the resources, perhaps things can be done quickly. But ultimately, if you're a startup, typically you're still trying to run a business at the same time. And it does take a lot of people off their eyes off the business to go and run something, run a process like that. In terms of the relationships, I think it's always important to do that regardless. Right from the very beginning, you're reaching out to everybody to share what you're doing, making those connections, or at least even the people that might have those connections for the future that you can utilize. Because there's always in the back of your head around, how, if we get into this position, who can we talk to and how can we sort of get out of it? Because the whole journey's one of problem solving, I think, along the way. So I think, advice from that perspective is, I think you have to think about it early. Investors typically will push you to do so anyway, especially if you're getting into the realms of that being an option and of interest. They're looking for a return anyway. Typically, most VCs are in a sort of a particular period of time. So it is really important, I think, to start sort of just preparing those foundations, in place and sort of thinking about that. And then obviously, if you go down that path, you make that decision. There's often a push and pull element to it. If you want to sell it or someone coming to try and buy you, and then there's the slightly difference of negotiations and processes around that, because the negotiation shoe is on slightly different foot. But it takes a long time. It really does. And just to make sure that you've got enough cash in the bank, I think most importantly to, see it through.
Stuart, thanks so much for talking to us about that. I think that's really valuable advice. Coming up to today then, and what you're doing with Heroes, can you tell us a little bit about Heroes and what it is?
I'd be delighted to, of course. It's quite interesting because it's a bit of a shift out of, my sort of typical background. But it's something I think that's been, reasonably close to my heart. I'll give you maybe just a quick sort of anecdotal story. Beforehand, I used to play a lot of tennis when I was younger. And there was one fellow who was, arguably the number one in our county, for example, in the UK. Easily the best player by far, playing nationals tennis, when he was sort of 17, 18, clearly had potential and great opportunity ahead of him. Then I went off to university, was sort of lost touch in the sort of local area and who was doing what. When we sold the business, I was back in the UK, and I took my two nephews for a little tennis lesson one very cold November's morning. And it was, sort of overcast and, very grim, typical European winter's morning. The two nephews, lovely as they are, had no desire really to play tennis. They were on the kicking the ball around like it was a football pitch. And there was this other fella, down the other end, the coach. And I said to my sister at the time, I said, "Who's that guy?" She said his name. And I said, "Crikey, that's the guy I used to play tennis with, when I was younger." And so we had this lovely catch up at the end, only at least his story wasn't quite as lovely as, I hoped. He literally was failed by the system, by sponsorship, by government funding. He came from a slightly less privileged background, and in any sport, that's that puts you behind the eight ball, so to speak. In terms of trying to make it make a successful career out of the sport. And unfortunately, he fell out of the system and has literally spent the last, 30 years, coaching people like this to try and make ends meet. And he deserved more because he was a super talented player. He's still, I think, number one in his age group, in the county now. And that kind of, it sort of planted a seed in my head in terms of, this is a problem. And I got back to Singapore. When you have something like that perhaps has some emotive impact on you, all of a sudden, everywhere you read and see, this just pops out in front of you. Whether it was the BMX rider in New Zealand who nearly committed suicide because she lost funding from the government, which is, I think it's now an Olympic sport. the badminton player, here in Singapore, who won the World Championship of Badminton in arguably the biggest, most passionate badminton, fan base in the world, and had to rely on charity basically to go and, carry on his career. To you read the Winter Olympics, there's another athlete and another athlete and another athlete who's basically had to sell their granny, to go and get to the sort of China to go and compete. And of course, they're also working full time, or they've sold all their property, moved back in with mum and dad, basically just to try and sort of get there. And it's wrong, because it's an industry that's worth over $1.3 trillion. There are 100 million athletes, 8,000 sports. That's huge. But that value is not necessarily, really, giving back to arguably the most important actors in this, in this industry, the athletes. The irony, which as we started to dive into this, it's, of course, you've got the people that are trying to get into sport or playing in a niche sport, but even the superstars in sport, yes, you see it everywhere how much money they're earning, but arguably they don't actually earn quite as much. The majority don't earn as much as we think they do, number one. And number two, even if they are earning a lot of money, they're trying to earn as much as they can in a very short space of time, because the minute they get an injury, that's it, it's done. They've gone from earning 200 grand a week or whatever it is to nothing. And that's a big, big jump. And thirdly, Ronaldo, for example, is a great example. He went to Saudi Arabia to play football, paying 170 million. Of course, that's a lot of money. But the amount of money that those people around him are earning from that is significantly greater. So not only then is the potential earning capability not there, it's also the maximizing of their potential is also challenged, for them basically to, fulfill their earning capacity and build a career out of sport. So that was basically the sort of premise of the idea and the problem. And then we sort of started looking at, the different options. We looked at investing in athletes, which was, a reasonable idea. There's a few businesses starting to look at that, using perhaps some of the newer blockchain technology to do so. But, we found that it was really difficult to scale, because then you start getting into the realms of legalities with blockchain. You get legalities with, what's it called, assets, securities laws, for example, in all these different jurisdictions, and it's different everywhere. And so you're really focusing on a small bunch of athletes with a small bunch of potential customers that are basically going to sort of invest in that. And then we looked at sort of charity, crowdfunding sort of type solutions. An interesting stat for here, apparently there's 4.5 billion sports fans in this world over the age of 18. 99% of them are aware of crowdfunding. Only about 5 to 10% of people actually crowdfund. And one of the biggest problems it tends to be that they just don't get anything back in return. And that's not even talking about the problems from an athlete perspective. So anyway, you've got this massive problem, hasn't changed for 30 years. The only thing that's changed is the industry's got bigger and richer, and still no one's getting it. So to be honest, for me, as perhaps someone that hasn't been in the sports industry necessarily, but has some obviously experience as a fan, but also I was never a really good player when I was younger, but someone that appreciates, what that is. It needs someone to come in and shake that up, to level that playing field, so to speak. So basically the crux of it was, I came across this business model in the States. Maybe you've come across it, Nick, called Patreon. Very, very cool business, membership club business. They basically create this sort of tiered subscription model for fans to access their creators and get engagement and rewards in return. I thought, wow, this is brilliant. What a wonderful business. More so because it's so suited to sport. One, the membership club. Fan club's been around forever. Subscription payments, we all know how to do it. You're not teaching anyone to do anything new. But the most interesting thing is in sport is this sort of the rewards and the engagement, what basically drives fandom and the power of the fans and that engagement. We put athletes who are arguably, excuse the sort of the pun here, but they arguably are our real life heroes, hence the name of the platform, number one. Until we put them on this pedestal and want to know what it takes them to become so brilliant at this sport that you've probably played down the park and can't work out how to do it, And so we become fascinated, not just how to do it, but what else are they doing in their life? What are they having for breakfast even, as an example. And so whilst you sort of see some of the other aspects like that on sort of social media, it becomes a very one-dimensional engagement. It's very difficult for the athletes to earn from it. So basically, as we look at this sort of model, the Patreon model, we're able to create this proposition that allows athletes to earn throughout their career. Multiple types of athletes, whether you're a rising star, a professional, a superstar, or even a legend, who all have different motivations for earning, but they all want or need to earn a sustainable, steady income. So that's basically what we're bringing to the table with this sort of model. So if we use the sort of sales tagline, so to speak, Heroes is a membership club platform enabling athletes and fans to connect, to inspire, and to invest in each other. So that's basically what the Heroes business is.
It's very exciting. How does it work then? If I'm a athlete, for example, how does Heroes work for me?
Yeah, so it's completely free for an athlete, first and foremost. So the athlete comes to the platform, join as an athlete. We help them to create a profile. But it's not just a one-dimensional profile like, man, tennis, age, career, stage. We help them to create their story, because really that's what we want to try and engage. It really is about the story. So we use data effectively to promote their story into the sort of SEO world, for example. We use that as a search functionality, for fans to find them, because when you're looking for an athlete to support them or to follow them, for example, it's not necessarily the fact that they're playing this sport, it's that they believe in something alongside that. So that becomes a really powerful part of that. We embed a lot of tools for them to create and share that story, which I'll sort of explain a little bit more in detail. And a little bit of education as well. What do people want to hear from you? How often do they want to hear? What does it need to look like? What kind of media is it that you'd want to share? So that's the core thing from an athlete perspective. Then we have the subscription model. We basically take a tiny cut of that, and all the money basically comes into their wallet that sits on the Heroes platform, which they can obviously access at any time. They can say, if you've got someone that wants to go to a tournament and they've got $3,000 sort of sitting in their wallet, they can ask us to give them $1,500, and they use that to go and pay for flights and whatever else that they may want, to do so. So it becomes very accessible, space for the athlete. How they earn, there's the three different tiers, which, we're using very typical sport naming convention: bronze, silver, gold. We'd be foolish to deviate from that. So bronze is very much around, it's almost like a chat function post, sort of social media post plus chat. So say you're a cricketer, for example. So one of the guys on the platform, we've got Matt Pryor, the ex-England cricketer, arguably a legend, wants to level the playing field in cricket, wants to be able to have a lot of people to get access to cricket. We have, him on the platform. He puts a post on there that says, "Oh, this is me, when I was back in the day hitting an off cover drive," whatever it is. I'm not very good with cricket per se myself. And then some comments, perhaps how he was feeling at the time. And then basically the fans can comment on that, but he can also comment back. So it's almost like a chat function that sits within a sort of social media. So you're creating a community around that athlete and the post and the information that they're basically sharing. And of course, it's all gated in terms of the money. So at that bronze tier, it's a very, very tiny amount, less than perhaps a cup of coffee, a month to go and get access to that. But you're starting to be a part of a very distinct group and community that has that insight, maybe a little bit more intimate, personalized access to the athlete. And then as you sort of go increase, it's all about earning, it's all about engagement, all about rewards. The silver tier, we're creating using some digital technology to create collectibles, for example, on behalf of the athlete to give back to the fans. We're creating a little marketplace where the fans can actually then brag about the fact that they've got these collectibles. They can sell them. They can therefore actually access money and earning themselves, which is pretty cool. So now the fans getting something back, from that following. There's a little bit more intimacy in terms of the engagement. So, you can vote, for example, what T-shirt to wear. You can send messages to your mum for your birthday from your favorite, sports person. It's all these sort of little functionalities, but it's all part of a subscription. You're not charging for each one. It's a very simple engagement. And then the gold tier really is around more of a one-to-one opportunity, tickets to do this, sit in the player's box, meet me in person, that sort of stuff. And then we're building this very sort of cool functionality like a brand marketplace that basically connects the athlete to a brand. And from the income that we can generate from doing that, we can actually give that back as effectively a loyalty point back to the fan, which that they can then go and use on our platform and potentially, outside of our platform over time, especially when we've got ultimately now the fan, the athlete and the brand all together. So basically, as you progress from an athlete perspective, the more you engage, the more you create, the better the creation, the more fans you get, the more fans engage, the more money you're earning, the more fans and athletes there are, the more brands there are, the more basically you can keep earning. And it doesn't matter, again, whether you're at the beginning of your career, because everybody's going to have a fan base of some description, to being a legend of this game, and perhaps there's the opportunity not necessarily money for yourself, but to actually give back to the sports. There's a real potential altruistic outcome from that as well. But then there's so many other things that we'd love to do with it, over time and what the future looks like. But that's the core of it, is creating this ecosystem, this sort of new economy almost. Presenting the athlete almost as a creator, but really being able to give back to their fan base, who arguably have the most amount of money, the most amount of time, and the most amount of interest to go and engage with the athlete.
This is incredible. This ecosystem that you're making, it's really ambitious. Before the call, we were talking a little bit about where you're at right now, and you were talking about a potential alpha release in perhaps the next week, next few days. I'm not sure exactly on the timeline. What will that alpha release include?
Yeah, I mean, it's typical MVP sort of stuff, right? It's the athlete profile, the fan engagement. That bronze tier is what comes first. But slowly but surely, we're sort of building the foundations, for everything else as that sort of goes through. And everything you design has to be with everything else. So it becomes a sort of modular type, platform as you sort of start to drive that through. So we're very excited. We've got a whole bunch of athletes all ready to go. Some cracking athletes with some amazing stories, which I'm going to pay money myself, to go and follow, because they're really, really incredible. From rising stars that are the next Bryan brothers from the UK to a national football coach in the Caribbean who wants to tell this sort of rising, what's it called? The movie, I can't think of it. The toboggan guy kind of story. Whatever it's called.
Cool Running, isn't it?
Cool Runnings, thank you. So you've got this really wonderful, ability to go and do that. And again, it costs less than a cup of coffee, every month to be able to go and sort of access that. And again, the more that you get involved in it and the more you want to get something back from it, the more that you basically can pay over time. And it just, basically sort of spirals from there, because everybody's winning ultimately from the platform.
That leads me on really nicely to my next question, which is about those sports people. How are you getting them into the platform before you have anything ostensibly to show them? We don't have something up and running yet,
Absolutely.
But here's the promise of what we're going to do. How are you getting them?
Trust me. Trust me, I'm a founder. There's a good line for you. That's ironic and amusing, I think, because it's only so true. But the intention has been to start building that network. Now, we talked about it even in the sort of previous business. It was so important for us actually to just start reaching out to your network from a research perspective, to talk about what we're doing, to share what we're doing, share the progress of where we're getting to. And I think, even when we were right at the beginning of the call, we were talking about understanding the problem and the customer, and basically what their needs and requirements are. What we've done, a lot of what we've put together is really an amalgamation of altruism and investment, keeping it in one very easy, simple place, creating a platform that makes it really easy for the athlete to sort of engage. It's almost sort of second nature. And so in doing so, of course, you've got that network and connectivity in place. And actually, I've absolutely been astounded by the number of people that have actually proactively reached out to go and sort of support this in terms of the connectivity. So a lot of that's come from there. But of course, also you're digging the depths of your network, to sort of try and find it. I mean, I went to school with the father of a very famous English footballer. So, I've obviously sort of been in touch with him to sort of see if we can get on there. Some of them are going to be an early adopter. Some of them aren't. but it's really finding those ones that are ultimately going to be there to sort of support you, because it just, it hits the mark in terms of ultimately what they want, and that's really the power of it.
We've been talking a lot about the growth of the sports market and how, unfortunately, in many cases, athletes aren't the ones benefiting from that rising tide. So not all boats are being risen. If we consider that, and that there are, power brokers in place who have benefited immensely from all this, do you see heroes as a potential threat to them, or do you see them as being potential allies in your mission?
I think with anything sort of like this, I would sort of say more ally than enemy, because ultimately we're working towards a common goal for that. We're not going to replace a lot of these sort of power breakers in here, but in the end of the day, if we're able to create more athletes, more heroes, we're able to create a scenario where, they can benefit, from their lives. They can afford perhaps other sort of things, or they can do other things in their lives. Ultimately, everybody's going to benefit from this. And if you look at the stats, the number of people that drop out of sport, not because they can't make it, but because they just haven't got the resources to do that everybody's losing out of that. The athlete, the power breakers, if we use that as the sort of definition, and of course, the fans in terms of the sport itself that don't get to sort of see that competition, and which ultimately creates the interest in the sport itself. So really, that's where we sort of see, I think, it being actually sort of quite it contributes, I think, to the greater good for everybody.
We've been talking about the creator side of heroes. You're effectively creating something of a marketplace. So there's another side to this, which are the consumers, the fans. How are you going about acquiring them?
Yeah, I mean, it's if I can use an anecdotal example, I think most interestingly, I was sitting talking to a friend of mine the other day, talking about sort of what we're doing. He's a huge cricket fan. And then he switches and says, oh, yeah, but my son's a huge basketball fan. And one of the first athletes we've got coming onto the platform is a really quite sort of famous basketballer in the Philippines. He's the captain of the sort of biggest team in the Philippines. So, oh, man, for a cup of coffee, again, the cup of coffee sort of anecdote, I'm happily pay every month for my son basically to have the chance to ask him a question to sort of, how to shoot a proper hoop or whatever the sort of terminology is. That's amazing, when someone can proactively sort of share that is something that they're interested in. But then when it comes ultimately to actually the acquisition of the fan itself, it's a little bit of the cold start problem. You can't have the fans without the athletes. So ultimately, there's an element of a push towards converting the athletes' current fans and current sort of community into that. But ultimately, there's a lot of stuff that we can do to go and drive that fan base, to augment that fan base through, again, sort of using data in SEO, for example. I'm a big fan of women's cricket, for example. Actually, this is a great opportunity to really drive the interest and viewership perhaps around some of the more sort of niche areas in sport, or areas perhaps that have not necessarily had the attention that they deserve. And I think that's where we can actually use that data to drive that sort of search functionality, both on the platform, but also in the bigger world, which I think, sort of becomes quite powerful. And there's a few other sort of tricks I think that we're going to have some fun with in terms of also, driving like recommendations, for example, using data around fan interest, around potentially new athletes that they might want to, to follow based again on the stories that they're telling, but also how we then, perhaps integrate this into the broader media, space. Because ultimately, again, it's about driving that interest for the, from an athlete perspective. The more athletes there are, the more sport there is, the more competition there is, the more viewership there is, the more basically, again, increasing that value of the industry as a whole.
Who are the rest of the team behind this endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, always, it's never one person, and I've been incredibly fortunate. And the interesting thing, I think, with building a startup is you have people at the beginning, you reach out, and sometimes life gets in the way and people have to go and do their sort of different things. But one of the things I think I've done a little bit differently is to, sort of broaden that team that have been engaged in it. Because actually the number of people, with really good ideas and input has really improved, I think, where we've come from. And so we've got a cracking group of people, basically involved in this from a number of different disciplines, from finance to legal to the Web3 space to sport, of course, and we're really sort of trying to get a whole group of people that can help us on that path. Now, of course, we're going to have a execution team that's going to be a little bit more sort of day to day as we start to really sort of push this live. And I've been incredibly fortunate with the people that have been on board and the backgrounds that they've come from, from tech, the sort of some of the companies they've worked alongside, including perhaps some of the ones we've talked about today in terms of the sort of proximity. And that gives us just a great knowledge around how we engage the fan, the messaging we need to drive, the product, how it needs to look like. I've got a cracking partner on the technical side as well that one of actually my advisory positions that has turned into our partner as well to deliver a lot of the technology, and they've been incredible. I will name drop them, Smart OSC. They're a great company in Vietnam who are run by a friend of mine, and they've done an incredible job, the team, in terms of being able to build the product as well.
Building anything isn't cheap, and especially building something as comprehensive as Heroes. Are you looking to raise for the company?
Yeah, so we had a little pre-seed round. We didn't really sort of share that at all. It was more just heads down and see if we can sort of get something out. And I think it's going to be important for us in the next sort of say month, I think, to start looking at fundraising for a proper seed round. I want to have the product live. I want to have some athletes and some fans on there to really sort of show that what it can do, and it's doing what we that we're planning for it to do. And ultimately, with that in hand, we can go out into the sort of fundraising space and start going down that path.
Approximately, how much do you reckon you'd be looking to raise for the seed?
This part, not quite sure. But, I think that it will be something that's sustainable enough for us to help us for at least sort of a couple of years, especially in the current climate. To really sort of hit some of the goals and financial projections that we've got in place.
Understood. Before getting on to your advising experience, I just wonder, is there anything I haven't asked yet about Heroes which you're saying, do you know what, actually I'd love if Nick brought this up so I could talk about X?
Not really. I mean, I guess the only thing that I could think of is maybe it's a call to action that if anybody knows any athletes, please come knock on my door, because we're it's definitely open for business, from that perspective. And that, I think, becomes one of the most important things. The athlete acquisition is going to be sort of critical. Again, we've been incredibly lucky, but also I think that the story has told itself, to a lot of these athletes as well. Like, we've got ex-Olympic swimmers, we've got, sort of top basketball players, ex-England cricketers, we've got boxers, we've got tennis players, badminton players. I mean, there's a whole, from like 14 all the way up to, legend that have retired. So it's really interesting, I think, where that value sort of sits. It's kind of starting to prove what we're actually, been thinking it will do. And so, the call to action is really, I think, one of the most important things is that if you think you've got a friend or an athlete, and especially if they're a superstar, we'd love to hear from them.
And if somebody was looking to reach out to you, then how would they reach out to you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the best way. I'm happy to sort of share my email address if anyone sort of contacts through this as well. It's very simple. It's Stuart, Stuart, at heroes.xyz, which is the domain. And hopefully we've got a new website coming up in the next couple of days as well, which will look a little bit better than the one that's on there at the moment.
So moving on then to your advising experience, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that and the kind of work that you do with startups and the nature of that advice that you provide.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been somewhat fortuitous, I think, in this. Well, firstly, I think it was sort of the thing that got me into doing startups in the first place. It was a friend of mine, actually one of the co-founders from my last business. He suggested I go along to one of these sort of mentor things, so these boot camp type things. And I joined on, and I absolutely loved being able to be there and give back. At the time I thought, they're not going to want anything from me, but it's really surprising how much you can give just to listen, actually, and to give some thoughts and feedback and experience, because not everybody's got, all of the tools in the sort of tool bag, so to speak. And I think that was sort of what started that, that sort of process off. But then, of course, as you gather more experience and sort of knowledge, especially having built a business, gone through the growth, all the ups and absolutely the downs, sort of selling a business, it creates some interest for people to say, okay, what did you go through? What are the things I should be looking out for? What are the things I haven't thought of that I should be thinking about? And that's really where it's come from. A lot of people have sort of proactively reached out and asked me to, be a partner for them to do that. And I've sort of looked at the few, and I've picked the ones I think that have, great opportunity, that where I see the problem or I understand the problem and could be a part of that. Some of it's to do with my experience, from a industry perspective. Some of it's actually more to do from just being a startup or commercial. If you, of course, when you start doing all these things, you start creating a bit of a network, and it helps that you can connect people to people that would be relevant to them, moving forward as well. But it really is the opportunity to sit down and listen, let them update what they're doing, where are their pains, what's keeping them up at night. They're that old sort of classic question, and that's really where I can come in and spend that time with them going through that. Sometimes it's just listening. Sometimes it's perhaps more reactive. Sometimes it's proactive, always being they're sort of always being there for them as part of the team, ultimately, and looking out for new opportunities for them. And sometimes it's actually sort of executing for them on certain things, whether it's a network connection or actually you're doing a piece of work for them. I'm quite happy to do these things for the guys that have trusted me to be a part of their business as well. I'm honoured really to be asked really, and to do that. And the best bit, the most beautiful bit, and I have to share this with you, is that you don't realise how much you learn going through setting up a business. Everyone tells you. And when you're in it, you're just building a business. You're just putting things together. It's actually just doing what you've kind of done or think you should be doing. But actually, when you take a step back and people go, "Oh, have you had this experience? Have you done this? Have you done that?" Oh, it's funny you should say that. This is what happened, and this is what you need to look out for. And all of a sudden, there's just this gushing of experience and knowledge that you can impart on people, and it's really rewarding to help them, sort of avoid those rather sort of potentially sizable potholes in the ground, that could sort of damage their business.
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because I recently heard as well some advice to the effect of you're best placed to serve, to support the previous version of you. So, you've gone ahead of these people and you've already climbed that ladder. So, you're actually really well placed to help those people who are just starting off.
That is an absolutely wonderful way of putting it. And I've never heard it put that way. But instantly when you say that, I think back at me at the beginning of oh my God. Because you really don't know what you're doing. You have an idea from corporate experience perhaps of some of these things, but you really are learning along the way. And, you can be naive with a lot of things, and I think it is really part of maturing perhaps in this process, things to look out for, whether it's legal, technical, people-related, commercial opportunities. It really gives you a very good view. I've been very lucky.
We're approaching the end of our call together, and I've really enjoyed this. I wanted to first ask, though, through all your experience, everything that you've done in the past, everything that you're doing currently now, your advisory work, for those who are coming up, for those, as we said, who are starting off on the ladder, what would be maybe the 2 or 3 key pieces of advice that you would give to early stage founders listening to this?
Yeah, number one, I would look after your foundation, your base. Manage expectations, because being a founder of a business can have a massive impact on you, your health, your wellness, your mental health. But it's really important to actually look after those around you as well. Obviously, the people in your business, but whether you're married, girlfriends, parents, kids, it's really difficult. It's really stressful. And if you're trying to spin all these different plates, I can tell you this from experience, it's really hard, to do that. And so first and foremost, I think it's really important to make sure that expectations are managed, that you've got a good foundation in place to sort of set you on that journey. Secondly, do it. Absolutely do it. Because the one thing, at least from my personal perspective, is that there's nothing worse than regret. There's nothing worse than, so sitting there going, I wish I'd done that, especially when the opportunity presents itself. you will never, ever be able to go and plan to go and build something. Right, in 2024, I'm going to go and do this startup and I'm going to go do it on Monday and it's going to go and be great. It never, ever happens like that. So you have to take advantage of that situation when you can. And it's never going to be a perfect, position either. You're never going to have enough money. You're never going to have enough this or enough that. You just have to find a way through it. And to be honest, that's what, as I said at the beginning, a founder's a lot about being, problem solver. You're consistently just having to put out fires rather, and solve problems, everywhere. And that really is a lot of what the role is, to be able to do that. And the third is, I think, and maybe this sort of comes first before those other two, is to really understand your motivations. We kind of touched on it earlier on. I did actually remember sitting down with a book, like a little exercise book. I found it the other day, actually. And I wrote the pros and cons of doing this and why I wanted to do it. And actually, it's quite important to be introspective and to be reflective on yourself around why you really want to do it. I've met so many people that says, I want to go and work at a startup. I want to be a founder. And when push comes to shove, they're not right for it. Not because they're not good at it. It's just, there's so much ambiguity, uncertainty. There's so much hardship. It's so much hard work. There are so many things it's not a pretty place to be, but it is and can be incredibly rewarding. But you have to know yourself, I think, through that journey. And sometimes it is, you find yourself on that, sounds really cliched. You do find yourself on that journey, but you really have to, I think first before, going down that path. Hopefully that's sort of helpful, but that would be the three things. And I haven't planned anything. I haven't pre-written that. Those are the first three things that come to mind.
Stuart, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think, your experience from hoolah has been so fascinating. Your successful exit, moving on to Heroes, and what you're doing there and solving a real problem for these athletes and transforming the space and kind of redistributing some of the money that's going around in such a successful industry. Giving back to the athletes and giving them more empowerment, I think is really a mission which I think we can all get behind. And now advising other startups and giving them great advice like you've just given today. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm sure the audience has too. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, absolutely, my pleasure, and thank you for having me as well. Thank you for sort of asking great questions and letting me sort of keep talking away. It's been great.
Thanks so much.